Good afternoon to everybody. My name is Kenji Sugihara. I'm the Director of Aviation for the state of Oregon and also Chair of the Emerging Aeronautics Committee. And I'm very pleased to have you here today. I'm excited to introduce two wonderful people. Most of you know at least one of them, but the topic for today is the lessons learned from Hurricane Helene. And of course, as many know, that happened a few months ago, and it was a pretty big disaster on the East Coast. And we're fortunate here to hear about the importance of general aviation airports, as well as drones in the response and then the cleanup afterwards as well. So today, Becca Gallus, the former director of aviation for North Carolina with a long storied history. She's been known as an innovator. She got a statewide environmental assessment for drones, as well as a number of feathers under her cap. She has been the team lead, policy development, design and construction, senior transportation engineer. So she's been in the industry for a very long time. She'll be co-presenting with Nick. Nick is the assistant unit head for photogrammetry. He's the interim aviation director. And in his decade of service to NCDOT, Nick has worked closely with the aviation division, including leading the effort to coordinate with stakeholders, other state agencies, and NCDOT to fly 1.6 million acres of imagery in response to Hurricane Helene. That's a lot of imagery. He has collaborated with the Division of Aviation to identify how innovative technologies such as manned aircraft censored and uncrewed autonomous systems can be used by the department, help lead the development of this Sanford UAS test site in partnership with Central Carolina Community College, and collaborated with DOA on a large UAS feasibility study. And with that, I will let Becca take the floor, and I'm looking forward to what you have to say. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Kenji.
Quick thing, Becca.
Yeah.
And for those in the audience, please hold your questions until the end. So we'll have a Q&A session at the conclusion of the presentations. So thank you, and go for it, Becca. Thank you.
And can you see my screen, Kenji?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. Great. All right. Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for joining us today to talk about our experiences from Hurricane Helene and some of the things we've learned. For us, Helene, I've said this a few times, but Helene was hands down the hardest thing I've ever done in my career. For me, though, it was from that devastation and challenge was just a lot of positivity as well, and a lot of really heartwarming stories and examples of incredible partnerships through adversity, like what we're going to talk about with Nick today. I know I have several members on the team. Our team was stretched in unique ways that we never thought we would, doing things we never thought we'd have to do and experiencing things we never thought we'd have to overcome. And it really took a village of many different partners to get across the line. So thank you to my team members who are listening in today. Also wanted to thank our peer states as well, talking to people like Gary in South Carolina, JP in Tennessee through this, but then also the many of you who just took the time to send me a bottle of wine like Kenji did, or Frank Farmer in Alabama, who called me on one of my worst days, and I think I cried on the phone with him for half an hour. So thank you to all of you for your support too. I know I might cry during this presentation. I think I've cried every time I've given this presentation at least once, so we're going to get through it together. But this has just been one of those capstone moments in, I think, our state's history and certainly my career. It's been a lot, but our airports have responded in just incredible and unprecedented ways. So we're incredibly proud of that. And I'm excited to share all of the things we've learned. And there's more to come because we're putting together a report on this that'll come out early next year. But really looking forward to sharing some of the things that we've learned and some of the things that we've overcome, and just the incredible work that North Carolinians have done to pull together to address this just devastation in Western North Carolina. All right, so you know me, I won't do a big introduction, but I recently did transition to a new role in the department and I will be transitioning during the month of December, transitioning to more of a broader transportation role with, it's called Division 5, which is the Greater Triangle, so the 7 counties around the Raleigh-Durham area, working on a multi-billion-dollar program here to deliver our construction, maintenance, and capital improvement projects. For me, this Helene is still going to be something that we're working on, and that Division of Aviation will still continue to be working on. At the Highway Division 5, we're still sending between 20 and 30 employees every week out to Western North Carolina to do things like replace culverts and pull shoulders and do all sorts of just maintenance type work to bring those roads back up. And we know Division of Aviation will be continuing to fly missions for the next 2 years to 3 years as we continue to rebuild in Western North Carolina. And I'm going to turn it over to Nick to do a short introduction, but I'm just so thrilled that Nick will be in this interim role as well. Nick and I have gone way back for several years, but have gotten really close in this Director of Aviation role. He's my counterpart over in photogrammetry, and so we work closely together to fly missions across the state with our photoplane as well as our drones to capture some of the imagery and to capture data around our different highway assets and transportation assets. So Nick, if you want to introduce yourself.
Yeah, thanks, Becca. Can you hear me all right?
Yep.
Awesome. Well, yeah, so I've been with the photogrammetry unit the last 8 years. My career kind of somewhat fell into it. Originally came on a transportation engineering associate program here at DOT, whereas for new, graduates, engineering graduates, to go into eventually leadership programs and kind of just learn all the different units and modes and divisions and get a good sense of how NCDOT functions. My background, of course, is civil engineering. So I went to school for civil engineering. Thought I was going to be building bridges and designing bridges and structures. Then I fell into photogrammetry, started doing aerial surveying. I've got some ties in aviation with my family. My father was in the Navy, my grandfather flew in the Navy. Mechanical engineering for Boeing for a number of years. And then my father was a commercial airline pilot. So aviation's always been a big part of me and my family. And that was a big interest going into aerial surveying and photogrammetry. And now I'm here. So, yep, thanks.
Thanks, Nick. So we're going to cover 3 main areas of what Division of Aviation, the role we played during Helene. So the first was coordinating safe air operations. The second one, which if you follow us on social media, we did a lot of work, was the communication space, which I think was a new space for us, particularly in disaster management. But I think a really important one that really helped ensure the success of the aviation response. And then lastly, talking about aerial imagery and how we supported our other transportation assets in recovery as well. Now, one thing that's important to know when you look at these kind of 3 different roles that we filled is how we typically respond to a disaster. So typically, if a hurricane hits Eastern North Carolina, we have a dashboard that you're going to see in a moment, and airports tell us how much fuel they have and how they're doing and whether they're flooded or not. We fly some drones and we go home at night and we sleep well. Helene was absolutely nothing like that in terms of just the breadth of devastation across Western North Carolina and the way that airports had to respond to the diversity and the volume of air traffic happening in Western North Carolina. So here's a quick snapshot of our 72 public use airports. The circled area is where Helene impacted. I think it was starting Thursday night, we started getting the hints that it was going to be particularly impactful in Western North Carolina when we started to see 24-hour rainfall totals that were over 20 inches. And we have a software that helps predict rain gauge rise and river rise. And we started seeing just historic projected river rises in these areas, particularly around the Asheville and Rutherford County area, going into that event into Friday. And so when we start thinking about some of the challenges that we had early on, there was a lack of power to many of these airports. They were operating under generators or with limited power within their airfield. It was almost impossible to get up with them. They did not have internet, and if they had cell phone coverage, they had cell phone coverage for about 45 seconds before the call would drop. Starlink in those first few days was not well distributed, and eventually several airports were able to get internet through things like Starlink and other satellite phone coverage. And there was just some really challenging weather conditions on those first several days coming out of Helene with low-lying cloud cover, high winds, and just not a friendly environment for operations. But we were starting to see a high tempo of operations. Now, when you look at these Western North Carolina airports, Hickory and Asheville are both towered, Asheville being our largest commercial service airport in the region, and Hickory being our largest general aviation airport in the region. But the airports that saw the most increase in traffic during this time were some of the smallest airports. So I'm sure many of you know here in North Carolina, when we talk about aviation, we talk about economic impact. But what was so incredible to me about this event is it was not about economic impact. Some of the airports with the smallest economic impact played the largest role in moving supplies to North Carolinians during those first several days when there was no other way to access them. So this is part of the story we're working to tell going forward is economic impact is important, but how do we also ensure that airports are ready to provide this valuable service with the millions of pounds of goods that move through North Carolina's general aviation airports and the hundreds of people that were saved through search and rescue operations out of GA airports. So we're working right now on that storytelling piece that really is going to shape our funding strategy moving forward and how we talk about aviation. Because economic impact is important, but at the end of the day, when a storm like Helene hits, you need those small airports and rural communities to be well funded with appropriate infrastructure and ready to respond to these events to provide that lifeline to your communities. So when we look at this, Jackson County Airport, which is the third, if you're looking all the way to the west, it's the third most western airport. It's an interesting airport because it's on top of a mountain. I'm going to show you some pictures of it later. But it's one of our smallest GA airports. And during Helene, they experienced a 3,400% increase in traffic. And Jackson County is an airport that is run by a volunteer and some just really passionate retired ex-pilots. And they had a 3,400% increase in traffic. They went from 4 to 8 operations a day to hundreds of operations a day. So we're going to talk about some of the strategies we put in place to ensure places like Jackson County were set up for success and able to handle that just dramatic increase of both National Guard traffic as well as private general aviation aircraft that were bringing important goods, supplies, and medical supplies to North Carolinians during that event. All right, so going into Thursday, several of our staff members are on what is called the Air State Emergency Response Team and the Infrastructure State Emergency Response Team. So this is actually, I know Kenji is in his CERT room or his EOC right now. So this is a Raleigh-based emergency operations center that manages the emergencies from the Raleigh-based area and then coordinate with the county-based emergency operations center. So we have presence on both those teams, and it's a group of everyone from the NCDOT to the FAA, the Guard, Emergency Management, Civil Air Patrol. And most significantly, this event was the first time they also brought in private airdrop groups. So we saw this huge and unprecedented increase in the private response to Helene. And in order to coordinate, and we saw in those first several days, there were stories of near misses, there were stories of safety issues on the airports. And so that really drove the need to coordinate more with the private groups than we typically have ever in the past when we kept the coordination just to government partners. But we really saw, we were not tasking them with specific operations, but we were providing them information and connecting them to information about operations to ensure that we could all cooperate in a safe and thoughtful environment because we knew that the role that they were playing in Helene was so important. Now, this is a snapshot of that dashboard that I mentioned. So this is typically what we do during an event. We set up this dashboard, we email all the airports. It says, hey, fill out your fuel, tell us if you're open or closed. And again, it works really great if you have communications, but in Helene, we did not have the communications. So we had wonderful staff, like I know Jason's online today, and Tom and several of our other staff who had to every day, 3 times a day, call these airports, find that one opportunity when they had cell phone service to be able to report on the infrastructure condition, whether they had any incidents on the airfield, and whether they had the fuel to be able to fuel some of the Chinooks and the large heavy lift helicopters that we were seeing coming into Western North Carolina. So if you don't have something like this, I encourage you to set something like this up, but know that communications may not always be available, but you need to be able to pivot and figure out how do you still get this sort of level of information with the resources you have. So some other things we saw were complex and congested air operations. So on the top right, you see all the Chinooks at one of our helicopters. So we had Chinooks, we had Blackhawks. When you talk to the public, they say it's the most helicopters they've ever seen in their entire life. The sky was just full of helicopters doing search and rescue and supply drops all across Western North Carolina. And at the same time, we had this just dramatic increase of guys with planes bringing stuff, we'll call it, from airports across the state, across the country, and all the way as far away from Canada. We found out later. So we had these heavy lift helicopters with all the complex downwash, and then we had these small GA airplanes who were all flying into Western North Carolina. So it was really important that we think strategically about how do we communicate and how do we manage safety during. The other thing we saw was these airports became really critical facilities. And during the first few days, like I mentioned, there were a number of safety incidents. So we talked about the FAA liked to say there were hundreds of near misses, but we didn't have a really great way of measuring that, but that's what the FAA said there was quite a number of near misses that occurred. As you can see, we had 2 incidences that were resulted in runway closures. So on the left is a wheels up landing that happened at Hickory, and on the right is a small aircraft fire at Rutherford, both of which resulted in closed runways that impacted the ability of GA air traffic to deliver supplies during that time period. The other thing that was really challenging was managing fuel supplies at these airports. So some of these, again, don't have high volume operations normally, have relatively limited capacity to be able to hold fuel at their airports. So we saw a number of airports, particularly in the first few days, that actually ran out of fuel. So we did a lot of messaging with making sure that you stop before you enter the disaster area to fill up with fuel, and then also working with our highway folks to be able to prioritize shipments of fuel to these airports so that they had near daily deliveries of fuel to ensure that they were topped up and able to support the general aviation and the National Guard aircraft as well. The other thing that really came out is the importance of airports identifying their community-based organizations. So I made the comment, we had GA airports flying in a lot of stuff. And in that first day or two, people didn't know what to do with it, right? Because there was just this outpouring of a very organic uplift of GA air traffic, bringing different sorts of supplies in. And we needed the opportunity to create order out of that. And the airports were so busy, they didn't have that time and those resources to be able to do that. So very quickly, our airports worked and partnered with community-based organizations in order to take the supplies that were being brought into Western North Carolina airports and then to distribute it to the communities. So when we talked to the airports afterwards, they said that was super important because it allowed them to focus on parking aircraft and safety, and allowed the community-based organizations to focus on offloading airplanes and then taking those supplies and distributing it to the local communities. So this is one of the biggest lessons learned when we talk about what we've learned from the post-Helene workshop, is the importance of establishing those relationships with community-based organizations that you can call on in situations like these to help support good delivery and get it into your communities quickly. The other thing that was interesting was hangar space was something that was needed to be able to accept all these donations, and then thinking about how do you get vehicles in and off the airport in a quick manner without log jamming the traffic around the airport. So a lot of future enhancements look at things like how do you pre-plan now in your emergency operation plan for where would a community-based organization operate on your airfield, where would you manage donations, and how would you get them on and off your airport quickly and efficiently. Now, one of the new roles that we took on during this event was related to staff augmentation. So I think it was the Sunday after Helene, we were about 2 days into the response, and there was an airport who called me, and he said, Becca, I haven't been home, because you have to keep in mind, a lot of these folks did not know the condition of their house. He said, I'm sleeping in a hangar, and he said, I haven't eaten in 2 days. And he had 2 other staff members who were in very similar situations. And that was a moment where we knew we had to act, and it was important that we figure out how do we get our little airports in Western North Carolina resources and staff, qualified people to help support them in doing the important work that they were doing. So that night we were able to find a gentleman who was able to drive there and be there and help fuel aircraft the next morning. So we took on pretty quickly after that first airport the role of coordinating the movement of Eastern North Carolina airport staff to Western North Carolina airport staff to provide them the opportunity to either go home or just help manage the incredible volume that was happening at that airport. Because again, remember, we're going from tens of operations to hundreds of operations at these small GA airports. So this is something that we're definitely looking at continuing to enhance how we do this better in the future. We learned how to do this from our highway divisions. So our highway divisions during a hurricane, they have sister divisions. So they partner a Eastern division with a Western division. So during snow and ice, they send the Eastern division staff to the Western division and vice versa during a hurricane. So similarly, we're looking at this with airports. So creating teams of multiple airports who during weather events can support, send support from their airport to their sister airports in order to support them with staffing in the aftermath of an event to support the diversity of operations happening. So this was a really, really great example of the airport community coming together in a really meaningful way that really helped ensure that we could all operate safely. My favorite picture here is on the left. I have a lot of favorite pictures in this webinar, by the way. But on the left, this is Hickory. So the gentleman in the black shirt is the airport manager at Hickory Regional Airport. The gentleman in the red shirt is a lineman from Raleigh Exec right in our backyard. And what's cool about this picture is the plane right behind them is actually delivering supplies from Raleigh Exec to Hickory. So it was a great opportunity for Noah, the lineman in the red shirt, to be able to fuel that airplane that originated from his home airport, actually. So a great example of just all the connections that happened during Helene and all of the positivity that came out of just a really challenging situation. Now, the other thing that had to happen was we had to take look at safety strategies. What things do we have to implement to ensure safe operations? The number one most successful thing, but number one least popular thing was the prior permission request line. So this list of 4 things on the right-hand side of the screen, if you're not familiar with these things, I encourage you to get familiar with them now and read some of the documentation around it. I wish I knew about it going into it because some of these things we would have implemented sooner if we had known that they were tools in our toolbox. So all of these things are tools in your toolbox that you and your airports can deploy when the situation arises. So make sure you know what tools are in your toolbox. And the FAA was really great in helping us understand these different tools, but super, super important to helping us manage traffic. So prior permission request lines during the peak was implemented at 4 different airports, most significantly being Asheville. And what this did, there was a perception that FEMA was controlling airports, which was not true, but this prior permission request line is where that rumor originated. So prior permission request lines are a NOTAM where the airman would call a number and request a time to land and then request a time to offload supplies. So it did not tell people, no, you can't land here. It just said, please schedule a time because we have limited ramp space and limited ability to support you at the airport. So very, very successful, but maybe some more education that can be done with the general aviation community to explain why those are so important during natural disasters and emergency response. The second one on this list is what's called a SAFER or standard use Army aircraft flight routes. So the image on the left is a National Guard operation strategy plan that we actually published for the first time on our website. And the yellow lines are the SAFER routes. So what that was, it was a coordinated effort between National Guard and the largest airdrop organizations where they agreed to cooperate in these flight corridors indicated by the yellow lines with certain rules about communication frequencies and altitudes and a variety of other things that allowed them to operate in high tempo corridors safely. And it's very similar to rules of the road too. So you fly on the right when you see an oncoming aircraft, but it provides some additional guidance on how to cooperate in a high density and high tempo operation space. So that's the first time it had been used domestically in a non-combat frame and worked very, very well, particularly with the very large airdrop organizations. So temporary flight restrictions were super controversial, particularly in day one. There was a story in the news about a sheriff who had put up a TFR and arrested a guy who landed his helicopter. And that was how we started all of Helene, was a front page news story about a TFR and people not being allowed to land their helicopters to provide life-saving care. So we had to work really, really hard to minimize our use of TFRs and do a lot of communication about how we were using TFRs. So after this first few days, we made it very clear that TFRs were only used in areas where multiple search and rescue helicopters were engaged in operations, or in areas where the large heavy lift helicopters were doing sling loads. There were some situations where VIPs were attempting to visit the area, and we worked with the FAA to find ways to transport those people so that they did not create TFRs or figure out how they could visit specific areas so as to minimize TFRs in the impacted areas to allow general aviation traffic and our Guard continue to operate in a robust fashion. So TFRs were definitely super controversial, and implementing other things like the PPR and the safer routes allowed us to use other strategies beyond putting up blanket TFRs that limit drone and GA traffic within a specific area. Now, the last one on here is another one that I wish I had known about on day one, which is temporary air traffic control towers. So by the end, we finally, I think it was like week 2, we set up a temporary air traffic control tower at Rutherford that I wish we had set up on day one. But it's a long approval process to get one set up. And then we just didn't know that it was a tool in our toolbox until later in the event. So that's something where we're going to put together some more documentation on how do we expedite that process, and how quickly can we get one on the ground if an event does happen. So it was really cool. It's basically an air traffic control tower on the back of a Humvee that the National Guard will bring to you. So really great for the time it was implemented, but wish it had been implemented sooner as well. So the next thing, once it was about 2 to 3 weeks of really high tempo operations, kind of firefighting day after day. The other big thing I'll mention that came up was who is in charge of an airport during an emergency. And this is something we spent a lot of time at this post-event debrief talking about. It felt like every sheriff in every airport wanted to take over the airport. And so we had to do a lot of work with our general counsel and the FAA to educate people on who's actually in charge of an airport. And who has the final authority, because there was a lot of perception that, this group or different sorts of organizations could come in and take over operations of the airport. So that's another piece where we're going to do a lot of education going forward on who's really in charge of an airport and how do you communicate that if you are the airport sponsor. How do you communicate that to all of your different people who are going to get excited about airports during emergencies? And how do you explain roles and responsibilities? Because roles and responsibilities was a little confusing at the beginning before people understood how to operate together appropriately. Some things we talked about and will be included in the report are communication and coordination with diverse stakeholders. For this one, I'll say on the positive side, one of the things airports commented on was through this event, they were able to reach people and bring people to their airport that had never seen their airport and maybe lived half a mile down the road. So earlier we saw a picture of people unloading supplies from an airplane. So that was Jackson County Airport that I mentioned before. And they're a pretty sleepy airport. And they said they had hundreds of volunteers from their community flooding the airport. So for them, not only was it an opportunity to serve their community, but an opportunity to connect with their community, who historically, when you talk about airports, just think about it where the private jets come in, right? So it was a really great opportunity to connect with their communities in a meaningful way and show the value of aviation in a very specific way as well. We talked about media, rumors, and misinformation. So we had a number of airports who were, dealing with angry people calling about information that they saw on Facebook or social media or in the news. And so we spent a lot of time talking about how do we best prepare airports going forward for the rumors that will circulate on social media, and how do we combat that and provide airports tools to manage that as well. We talked about staffing support, which I mentioned earlier, is something that we're going to continue to grow that program on. How do we move qualified staff to airports that are impacted by disasters? We talked about safety and the safety strategies that we saw on the previous slide, resources, and then infrastructure constraints. So we actually have the proposal in specifically to look at power. So power was one of the biggest issues that we saw, and one of the biggest barriers to reopening was the ability of an airport to turn on the lights on the airfield or the terminal or the weather system. So there's a big need at some of our airports who don't have generators. How do we get generators, and how do we fund generators and other things like microgrids as well? So working with our General Assembly and our different stakeholders to build out that funding piece associated with power and then communications as well, and thinking about how do we build back better through this. Now, you probably, some of you who might have seen the news, you've seen that there's been a lot of damage in Western North Carolina. One of the cool things about Helene is that North Carolina airports sustained less than $1 million of damage, which if you look at the highway side, the highways have $5 billion with a B, $5 billion worth of damage, and that number grows day after day as they find more sites and kind of get into some of the issues and try to figure out how to solve these transportation challenges. So we were really, really pleased that we had so little damage, but we know that we're going to play an important role going forward. And so how do we best prepare our airports going forward to play the important role that they played during this first few days when they moved millions of pounds of supplies and saved hundreds of people through general aviation airports? So we're working on 2 items related to this. The first is the handbook that I talked about, the report of lessons learned and best practices. And the second one, you all know our state of aviation, or many of you know our state of aviation report. So working on quantifying the impact of airports during Helene. I have the numbers for the government response. We know how much the Guard moved through Chinooks, and we know how many people they saved, but the private response is so diverse and broad. We're working with NC State to do some surveys to wrap our arms around just how much did that private aviation response impact North Carolina in terms of volume and people and all the sorts of incredible work that we did. And what are some of those stories that we saw and some of the pictures that we saw, and kind of capturing that in a way that helps share the story and the value of aviation and disaster response as well. So I know this started out as an AAM thing too, so I have to make sure to connect it back to that before Nick gets to that in a second. So the other interesting thing is this summer we worked with NC State and Ohio University to get a grant for looking at AAM in Western North Carolina airports and Kentucky and Ohio as well. So it was interesting to watch this kind of play out in real time and see the value of aviation in Appalachia while also working on this grant project. So excited to kind of work through that still with Kentucky and Ohio. But some of the things that we're really thinking about is in Appalachia, how do we create energy generation hubs at these airports so that they are prepared to provide the service during a disaster? And how do we create that, just the infrastructure investment within those communities to be prepared for future technologies? And how can advanced air mobility and eVTOLs continue to grow that response and grow how aviation is able to support North Carolinians and other communities during disaster response as well? So next I mentioned communication. So this was an interesting one because at Division of Aviation, we're all engineers or pilots. And so communication did not come naturally to us, but it very quickly emerged as a need very early in Helene. So early on in Helene, I think it was starting Saturday, I started getting calls. People wanted to know what was going on. So I started doing a daily email update to our airports and to our stakeholders, letting them know what was going on. We had a lot of partners in the space. So the FAA was trying to communicate things. The Guard was communicating things. The Air Cert was communicating things. And because the division had the one-to-one relationship with airports and airports had the one-to-one relationship with their pilots, we found that the best way to communicate across all these stakeholders was through the Division of Aviation, because we had those relationships on the ground with those stakeholders. So I knew that was happening when I was on a pilot group on Facebook, and I started seeing screenshots of my emails being reshared in pilot groups. And that was like a light bulb moment for me when I started seeing my emails that I just sent that morning being shared as an authoritative information source on social media. And so that was a moment when we all kind of got together and talked with our leadership and asked to take on a stronger role in communication. Up to that point, the FAA had been trying to do some level of communication and had set up a website, but it had not percolated down to the pilot level, and we hadn't seen that information making its way into the hands of people who needed it. So because of that, we took a much stronger approach to communication. So again, if you followed us on social media, you probably saw these blue screen updates and all of the information we tried to push out through social media. At the peak, we were doing between 2 and 3 posts a day with either educating people or trying to dispel rumors or trying to share the good work that aviation partners were doing in Western North Carolina. And so that was an important part. And then we also worked closely. There was a lot of national media attention, particularly the FAA got the CNN and CBS and another number of other media outlets really interested in the story around safety. So there was a lot of both national and local media attention. So one of the themes that we learned from this was the importance of social media and then traditional media, and then doing both, because it's not, these days, it's not just enough to make a press release. You really have to try to figure out how do you connect with people at different levels. Because particularly with pilot communities, we were seeing a lot of chatter happening on Facebook and a lot of information getting pushed out that way. And it wasn't necessarily correct information. So meeting people where they get their news and how they get their news was really interesting. I actually read a lot of articles during Helene about how best to leverage different platforms for news, because we were seeing so much just communication happening at different levels across different platforms and different media sources. Now, this kind of all culminated. We were seeing, I had to sit through a congressional briefing, and our congressional delegation said, we just want somewhere to send our pilots who are asking us about this, because We can't keep resharing Facebook posts, and we can't, we just want one spot with the right information instead of sending them to a NOTAM here and a TFR there and a GUARD website there. So this culminated in the Division of Aviation setting up a website for pilot coordination. And this is something where we are going to save this, and day one going forward, this is going to go up, this website here. The goal of this was to provide plain language, not just for our general stakeholders, but also for pilots, to educate them on the different safety strategies that were being implemented, where they were being implemented. This was also our place where we publish our National Guard operational maps and share that information with our pilot communities. And it's also where we did a fact versus rumor. So we directly addressed a lot of the rumors we were seeing on social media about FEMA taking over airports or FAA not letting drone pilots fly. We directly addressed it both on here and then again on social media as well. So this was a really, really great tool that our airports were also able to use. So we sent it to our airports, and when they got those angry pilots or angry citizens calling, they were able to direct them to this website that was in relatively plain language, explaining what was happening, so that they had some cover as well, so they could focus on the important work that they were doing, which was fueling aircraft, parking aircraft, and ensuring safe operations at their so this is one where we've spent a lot of work over the last year developing social media, and it really paid off during this event. As I mentioned before, we just got incredible engagement, and we got a lot of really, really good feedback too afterwards. I think it was about a month after the event started, I was at a pilot group, and they were all so incredibly thankful because they said they would see like misinformation on their Facebook groups, and they would be able to go over to Division of Aviation and then just forward that post on to whoever was sharing inaccurate information. So something that we're definitely going to continue doing and growing is figuring out how do we interact better with our pilot groups on Facebook, particularly how do we create those relationships and those connections now so that we are armed and prepared for those events going forward, so we can share out correct information and also share positive messages as well. So this is just a quick snapshot of our social media. We got nearly 700,000 impressions during the storm. But the highlight was that quote that I stuck at the top, which said, someone I think it was on LinkedIn said, in a pile of messaging from various sources, the divisions have been succinct, relevant, and factual. And he called them blue screen updates, which for me was just an incredibly succinct way of saying some of the things that we were working towards, which was creating relevant, very digestible, and appropriate information and making it available to our general public and our pilot groups as well. So something where if you don't have social media now, I encourage you to think about if that's a good fit for you, if you have the resources to do it. For us, we do have a comms person, but this is one of her 3 jobs. And we generally do like 1 or 2 posts a week. But during Helene, the investment we put into social media really paid off with our ability to communicate with people and share safety information. So we're very glad we made that decision. But it is another thing to do, but it's something that we think is really important. It helps us tell our story. It helps us tell the safety story as well. All right, so now we're going to transition to aerial imaging, which was the whole other side of what we were doing. So we were managing airports, but at the same time, we were flying millions of acres of land in Western North Carolina. So just a few examples of what happened. On the left is I-40 in Old Fort Mountain. So it was Saturday morning, and I started getting phone calls saying, we need images of I-40. We need images of I-26. There was just devastation everywhere, and they didn't care what the picture was. They just needed pictures so they know what was open, what was closed, what road was still there. And so people like Nick and our drone pilots were able to answer that call and respond appropriately. Old Fort Mountain was interesting because it was the easternmost section of I-40 that was impassable. So there was a huge mudslide, as you can see in that picture that took out I-40. So that was NCDOT's priority for the first 2 days, was clearing the mud off the road on I-40 to enable I-40 to reopen going into Asheville. So that was a critical piece. And it will come back in 1 minute when I tell you another story that we had. In the middle is Lake Lure Dam. So Lake Lure Dam, you might have heard about the town that was wiped off the mountain. That was Chimney Rock, which is right above Lake Lure Dam. Lake Lure Dam was important because that first day, they actually thought there was a high probability of that dam failing. and further flooding the communities downstream of that dam. So that dam was flown, I think, 3 or 4 times on day one and several times on the subsequent days as well. So another really critical asset that we were able to provide coverage on. And then just a great picture of Swannanoa, which was another community that had really widespread devastation that we were able to grab images of. So in total, these are just some of the stats, but on the left, Nick and his team flew 1.6 million acres in our aircraft, our little King Air C-90, over 11 missions. And I'm going to brag on Nick for a second, but they just did things that we've never done before. He's going to talk a little bit about their cadence, but they did innovative things like fly whole counties, which the division and photogrammetry have never had to do before. But because of the widespread devastation, we had to think creatively and we had to think bigger in terms of how we were capturing images. And then on the drone side, we flew nearly 300 missions, and this number keeps rising because every week we're flying more missions and reflying sites that we flew before, across 26 pilots and nearly 7,000 images there as well. So I will say the one theme before Nick gets into talking about all the incredible work he did is Helene. When we usually talk about hurricanes, we talked about drones a lot. Helene, what we learned is that it's about having the right tool for the right job. So drones played a role, Nick and his shop played a role, Civil Air Patrol played a role, and I go back to that toolbox metaphor. It was all about having the right toolbox in the right tool in your toolbox at the right time and knowing what those tools were. So Saturday morning, when we start getting calls asking for images, the cloud cover was too low and we couldn't fly our photo plane into Western North Carolina. So we established a brand new partnership with the Civil Air Patrol, who happened to sit next to our chief pilot, Thad, in this air cert. Thad said, "Hey, can you fly this?" And they said, "Give us 20 minutes," and they were in the air. So that day, Civil Air Patrol, because of that low-flying cloud cover, they were the first people with eyes in the sky who flew I-40, they flew I-26, and they flew several dams in that area. And basically, it was a guy with a handheld camera who took pictures out of windows. But for that day, that was the images that we needed. We needed situational awareness images, and that's what they provided. Now, as you might ask, well, why didn't we fly it with a drone? One of the challenges with Helene was that there was widespread damage to the highway infrastructure. There were some drones pre-positioned, but because there was so much highway damage, it was almost impossible to get drone teams where they were going in the first day to 2 days. As we started seeing situational awareness of routes reopened, we could start strategically and safely deploying drone teams, but it was hard to really get widespread coverage of drones right away because of the inability to drive teams into those areas. The other issue with drones is with their limited range in terms of how far they can fly, drones were not able to provide widespread imagery like what a photo plane could do. So the photo plane was an important tool, and Civil Air Patrol was an important tool because they could fly huge corridors and huge swaths of Western North Carolina at a relatively quick pace and provide those images back relatively quickly as well. So each one of those different tools played a different role, and Nick will talk a little bit about how we process the data differently and how, I think I saw Jamie on the call, how Jamie from our GIS unit helped us process the data in novel ways that allowed us to put insights into the hands of our field and to think broadly about how we capture imagery beyond just drones or just the photo plane. Now, I will put in the success story that our team had before I switch it over to Nick. So you all saw the mudslide at Old Fort. So it was Sunday afternoon. We were about to reopen I-40 going to Asheville from the east, so westbound I-40 going to Asheville. They had just started, the mud was almost off the road, and our drone team happened to be out there flying in the area to monitor some of the traffic and some of the different situations going on around that specific site. And they happened to see a little bit of scour from above on this bridge on I-40 over the Catawba River in Western North Carolina. And that was between Old Fort and Asheville. And so because they saw the scour, they were able to then fly their drone under the bridge. And you can see the image that they captured on the right, which showed just the incredible scour that happened under that end vent and how eroded all that embankment is, which is really a critical structure issue. And so because of our team's see something, fly something procedure that they were operating under, they were able to identify a critical structure and notify structures management very quickly. And then repairs were able to be put in place very quickly as well that enabled this road to reopen safely shortly after it was identified as well. So this was a great example of our drone operators having really great situational awareness, being able to communicate quickly to the appropriate team members to allow traffic operations to resume after appropriate repairs were made as well. All right, so I've talked a lot, so I'm excited to send it over to Nick now. I've really enjoyed working closely with Nick during the storm. The work his team did coming out of the airplane and all the information was just historic and unprecedented. So I look forward to hearing Nick share a little bit more about the work that photogrammetry did.
All right, awesome. Thanks, Becca. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Beautiful. So before I dive into our role in Helene, I just kind of wanted to give a little background on our unit. Maybe some folks on here don't know much about photogrammetry. Maybe it's the first time you've heard the word. I assume most folks have heard, but photogrammetry is a remote sensing technique that's very popular in the surveying industry, the mapping industry, and it's used in other industries as well, like the medical industry and so on and so forth. But back in, it was used very heavily, at least on the aerial side, aviation was used very heavily in World War I, and between World War I and World War II, it became a conventional kind of large scale mapping tool. And so by World War II had ended, photogrammetry was being used commercially, it was being used in Department of Transportation, so on and so forth. So our unit here at NCDOT, our first mission was March 1955. So that left black and white photo. That is the first mission and the very first exposure that our unit took and processed. Since then, we have flown 11,000 missions successfully. Well, that was as of September 2024, and of course, photogrammetry is, and I'll give you a basic definition. It's the art, science, and technology of deriving 3D information from 2D images. So we are collecting imagery. We've got a large format metric camera mounted on the belly of the King Air C90. Collecting imagery is just, a piece of what we do. We also map. And so there in the middle where it says photogrammetry averages, roughly 92,000 acres per year, that is the mapping that we do. That is kind of the bread and butter and one of the deliverables that we give to our customers and clients, which was particularly design engineers. So these are vectors and 3D vectors in a CAD environment, like a MicroStation and just a computer-aided drafting design software. So, all right, you can go to the next slide, Becca. So some of the products we do, of course, orthophotography. This is ortho. You can make scientific measurements. This is the state fair, the very famous state fair here in North Carolina. We do partner with other state agencies, but 95% of our work is for NCDOT projects. LiDAR mapping. So we don't just do photogrammetry. We've been involved in LiDAR since the late 90s, early 2000s. When GPS really was getting used, and being basically came about in the 90s. Aerial LiDAR also started to kind of make its way into the industry. North Carolina was also the first to do a large scale LiDAR collection of the state. I believe that was in 2001. Our unit was heavily involved in that, and we've still been involved, and we've been collecting over the years, and are actually back now collecting now. Well, not we, but we have external partners that we utilize for this, and are collecting statewide. But we also use LiDAR on UAS as well, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. So you go ahead to the next slide. And a couple other products, of course. If we can create maps, we can derive 3D information, we can create digital terrain models. So a lot of construction projects, we fly large scale construction projects where we do like earthwork quantification. There in the center, again, you see some topographic mapping. Shell plan sheets is kind of our jargon, what we call here at NCDOT. And then lastly, another service is emergency response. So that's what I'm going to talk about here the rest of the time. So go ahead, next slide, Becca. And you can keep going. All right. So as Becca stated, we flew roughly 1.6 million acres. This is big photogrammetry for us. We had never flown counties. You can kind of see in kind of the southwest area by Asheville, you can see some of those little tangents of imagery, a little hard to see down below those big blocks of the imagery. That's what we're used to. We're used to flying maybe 6-10 miles of just a bunch of tangent flight lines, and processing that. But there you can see some of those big blocks. Some of those, we flew multiple flight lines. Then they were spanning like 40 miles long. So that was big data. Just to give you an idea too, and I think this might be on the next slide. Becca, if you want to move to the next one. Yes, so this was big data. Our camera that we have is a large format metric camera, the Vexel Eagle Cam Mark III, 450 megapixel camera. So each picture roughly 2.5 gigabytes in size. So you can see here on the left, one of our challenges was dealing with, when we flew these counties, processing this data, and not just processing, but literally just moving data from the camera to our computers, to the network, back to the another computer to process, back to the network, then ship it to the customer. That was a big challenge for us. We had network slowdowns that we were going through. The size of our local storage, we custom build all of our computers, and for the most part, we're just chasing it. A terabyte is more than enough for hard drive space, and that was not enough for Hurricane Helene. So that was some other challenges, and as well as some other IT challenges like firewall and upload speeds. All right, you can go to the next one, Becca. And then as Becca stated, there was thousands of UA missions done across the state every day, all day. There was folks from all over, from the divisions, from other units. I know our location and surveys, our boots on the ground survey crews, they were out there just nonstop. And so here is some of the pictures that we helped. So we went out and supported Division of Aviation. They have an in-house crew based here in Raleigh. Went out and we had one of our staffs go support them for a number of days. They were in and around 226 and 226A, around Little Switzerland and McDowell County, and you can see, just some of the devastation that they saw. And they had like a folder of probably 26 folders with just 10 to 20 images like this, and it was just they saw so much in just 3 days. So it was quite biblical, the destruction. And then Becca, if you want to go to the next one. So this is what was great too, like Becca was saying, is it's really important to bring all this data together for the divisions and for executive leadership and stakeholders and so on and so forth. We've got UAS flights here, we've got CAP flights here, we've got our flights from the photogrammetry unit. There was other external partners there that flew, I believe. NOAA flew, I think FEMA flew, NEARMAP flew. There was a lot of birds in the air. There was a lot of imagery kind of everywhere. And Division of Aviation did a great job of kind of capturing all that in a GIS environment and kind of putting it all in one place. So that way you can kind of view everything right there and keep things organized. So here's just a couple screenshots of some of those. So that was very helpful. All right. Of course, like Becca said, the clouds were very, very challenging the first week. I remember when we got the first call, I think it was that Friday night, I got a call. That was the first request we got to fly right after I think everything moved out on a Thursday. or maybe it was Thursday, I can't remember, but get the call. I raced back to the office with some of our crew to kind of start planning some missions. So we got everything planned. We were ready to go. The next day, woke up on a Saturday, and cloud deck too low. Way too low. So we were trying to fly. We had got a request to fly the I-40 damage along the Pigeon River there at the border of North Carolina and Tennessee, and we couldn't. We tried lowering our flight, height or elevation, but due to the mountainous terrain, we could only lower it so much, and so we just had to wait it out, and it was that was hard, because there was so much going on. And we knew that the divisions really needed some imagery and some data out there to get that section opened. But fortunately, that was where the tools for UAS really came into play. We could have not maneuvered, how a UAS can in these conditions, especially with that low cloud deck. So we had tapped some external partners. This was a Skyfront, so this was a hybrid kind of basically the gas engine, to my understanding, powers the batteries or charges the batteries, and then there's electric motors that actually power the propellers on the copter. I think it's got a crazy endurance. 3-5+ hours, and they had a LiDAR sensor as well as a couple other photogrammetry type sensors on there. So they were able to fly roughly, I think it was about 5 or 6 miles a corridor in about a day or two. And so they collected all that data, processed everything, and then we went in and helped out and did QA/QC for this. As well as make some cross sections. And so you can see there on the bottom right, you're looking at a cross section there. And so that orange line on the bottom, that was the data, that was, elevation data from the LiDAR flight after Helene. And that white dashed line, that was LiDAR data from like 2017, so pre-Helene. And you can see right there, kind of just in that one section of essentially 1 foot, how much dirt moved. And I know you can't read the measurements on that cross section, but the height of that section is roughly like 60 to 80 feet. Just in that one section. So 60 to 80 feet, there was just a lot of damage and destruction to that embankment there. And this is just one section. The section you see too in the cross section, if you look in the point cloud to the left, you can kind of make out where some of the damage is. That section was one of the worst. I think that was the section that was in the news in a lot of pictures nationally. I think it spans like roughly 800,000 plus feet in length. And there was many other sections all along this 5 or 6 mile corridor with damage like that. This was one of the worst sections, but yeah, this was great. So here's another thing we did as well too. We created like a heat map. So instead of having those like 2D files, and we did those cross sections every 25 feet. So you kind of miss every 25 feet. You don't know what exactly happened in between. So here we created a heat map. So this was very useful. Again, this was in a GIS environment. So here you can see this is like an elevation difference between like pre or before Helene hit and then after. So you can see there's in that red section there, and this is the same section we were just looking at, upwards of 60 feet of elevation difference, and just there was a lot of destruction there. So. All right. Some good news, at least for the state of North Carolina. We're very fortunate and we're very geospatially rich. We have a great ortho program where we fly the state, or at least sections of the state, for ortho photography, as well as we're currently kind of building a similar program for LiDAR collection, statewide LiDAR collection. So NC Emergency Management, our NC Emergency Management has secured funds of about $9 million, and contracts are going in place right now for birds to be in the air early next year. I'm hoping January, no later than February, we'll be collecting LiDAR for all the Helene impacted counties. We had made a request to collect imagery and get that funded. NCDIT manages the statewide ortho program here in North Carolina, but unfortunately that did not get approved. So there might be some things that, you know, the photogrammetry unit and Division of Aviation here can help out, because I know there's definitely a big need to kind of continue to collect imagery to really kind of help monitor the reconstruction of all the impacted areas. So. And then last, but certainly not least, again, is innovation, not just in photogrammetry, but in remote sensing and aerial surveying. One of the big innovations that's really being used is LiDAR. It's here. Years ago, we used to always say, "Oh, it's the future," but it's here. It has gotten cheaper. It has gotten easier to process. It has gotten smaller. The sensors have gotten more compact. It's gotten more accurate, precise, very powerful. And so, you know, what LiDAR is it used to be an acronym, stand for light detection and ranging. Now it's kind of understood as just a word, but essentially, you know, these sensors shoot out a cluster of photons. And they come out of the sensor, they hit an object, and hopefully they return back to the sensor. And by the time, there's of course like a clock on the sensor, and then the speed of light, it can calculate distance, right? So with that distance, you get like, you can put that in like a CAD environment, 3D environment, like XYZ coordinate. So in that top right, that's kind of what you're looking at there. It's kind of a lot going on. There's two tunnels. This is on I-40 along the Pigeon River Gorge. There at the border, you're looking at a very massive point cloud. You can kind of start to make out the entrance and exits of the tunnel and some of the walls. You can see the roads, maybe a little bit of curb and gutter. And then of course, all that like teal and green, those are all, you know, vegetation, right? And so if you look to the left, that was a photo that we took from our crewed aircraft for doing photogrammetry. And you know, from the images, of course, we can compile and extract a lot of information, but we have to be able to see it. And that's kind of a con. You can see in that picture, you really can't make out the tunnels there. You can't see underneath that vegetation. You have no idea what's going on with the ground under there. And that's what's great about LiDAR, is the ability to kind of penetrate the vegetation. Now, of course, these photons, they don't actually penetrate. They can't see through cars. They can't see through leaves or branches. But what it does is it shoots a cluster of photons, and maybe you have a leaf, and where maybe only a third or a couple of those photons hit the leaf, return and get your vegetation XYZ, and then the other photons continue to carry on and hopefully hit ground, because that's primarily what we're interested in. So you process, you get this big, you know, messy point cloud up to the right, and then down below that bottom photograph, that is that clean, beautiful 3D model of that processed road. You can make out the curb and gutter. There's no vegetation in the way. You can see exactly what the ground's doing. Maybe there was a drop inlet or something else going on. And that was just very powerful with LiDAR. So very cool. And so this was utilized and is being utilized a lot in Helene. Especially to one of the big, you know, instances, again, going back to photogrammetry, we can only map what we see, and we can't see through the trees, of course. And so when Helene hit, you know, it was leaf on season. There's leaves everywhere. It wasn't even fall yet. It was about to be fall, but it wasn't really truly kind of fall yet, and leaves were still on the trees, and there was just so much destruction. We couldn't see anything. So LiDAR's played a crucial role in helping us kind of map and assess all the damage out there. So. And I think I got one more slide, Becca. Oops. And so lastly, this is kind of, future, like Becca, did a great job on the aviation side as to, kind of say, okay, hey, if this were to happen again, and let's really hope not, right, this was biblical destruction. This was just a crazy event. But if it were to happen again, we need to be prepared. What could be some things that could help us? And using artificial intelligence, there's a lot of potential. This is the future. So there's lots of geospatial firms, aerial surveying firms that are already using artificial intelligence to map faster, to create orthos faster, classify LiDAR faster, extract building footprints, pavement crack detection, power line classification and extracting power lines, and even damage assessment. So there's a little screenshot I snapped right there called the damage assessment for drone imagery. We have not used this yet. This just came out by Esri, I think like a week or two ago. But it's a pre-trained damage assessment model. And I believe it was a model that was fine-tuned by a data set of over like 10,000 images in partnership with the Civil Air Patrol. So just things like this, there's lots of kind of resources out there through GIS and pre-trained models out there. Of course, you can dive deeper and do things, on your own. But yeah, so this is kind of the future. But I think that's all I have. Again, I can't emphasize enough. I think one of the biggest things, and I love what Becca said a while ago, was you can't over communicate an event like this. That really got passed around. And I think when we at Photogrammetry heard, Becca say that, we all kind of were like, yeah, that's very true. And you just can't over communicate enough. There's lots of communication, lots of coordination. And this really was truly a team, effort. We really couldn't have done what we did without everyone working together. So Becca, you have any closing thoughts?
No, one thing that I did want to point out, Nick, and since Jamie's on here, one of the incredible things is I think it was like day 4 or 5. By day 4 or 5, we collected more images than we had ever collected in a day before. And the script that our GIS unit uses to geospatially locate all of our images broke because it had never dealt with that many images before. And it was just a huge testament, one, to just the devastation of the event, but two, the importance of DIT in some of these conversations and making sure that they're an important stakeholder when you have these conversations. It's not enough to fly drones. You have to figure out what do you do with the product and how do you make it useful for the end unit. And your DIT departments or your stakeholders' DIT departments are so important in ensuring the success of that. I mean, Jamie and the GIS team had many late nights helping fix that and figure out how to process images. That the processing, flying drones is almost easier than managing just the diversity and the quantity of data that comes through during some of these events. So it's really important to think about how do you relate to DIT and how does that all fit together. So it is teamwork again, Nick. That's exactly what it is. What are the tools in your toolbox? Who are the different players on your team, and how do you all work together effectively and efficiently during just unprecedented events? So Kenji, we'll turn it back over to you for questions or comments. Or see, I told Nick he was worried it was going to be too short, but we talked a lot. So
yeah, that was absolutely perfect. And to be honest, that was very, very useful. Some folks from emergency management here walked out of the room. You're the person we have to coordinate now, right? I was like, yeah. So it's definitely spurred some conversation. The lessons learned, it's phenomenal to see this. It's a terrible tragedy, but to see your insight, both you and Nick, just giving us information is fantastic because, of course, in Oregon, we are looking at a Cascadia subduction zone event, which would be a 8.0 plus earthquake. So it's and there was just an earthquake off the coast of California that was a huge reminder of this. So this is very timely. This is very, very informative as well. So I appreciate the time and effort that the both of you put into making this presentation and preparing this, because this is phenomenal. So at this point, it's a question and answer, but I am going to take the chair's prerogative and ask you the first question, Becca. So first, two questions. Did you enjoy the wine? And then second, the question that I do have is, do you see value in pre-positioning equipment at some of the rural GA airports? And do you anticipate coming out with a list of equipment that you'll be pre-positioning if you do see value in that?
So one, yes, the wine. Kenji has excellent taste in wine. I highly recommend being friends with Kenji so you can get some Oregon wine. Note to Nick for later. But two, yeah, Kenji, you're spot on. That was one of the action items from the workshop. So we're creating that list. So everything from cots to generators. We even talked about one of the biggest challenges was porta-johns, like with all the volunteers on site, the importance of providing facilities. And so we are preparing a list. It's, you know, the Viper radios, the Starlinks, and we're probably also looking at funding it and then housing them at our hangar and then pre-positioning them. So they're accessible to general aviation airports after a storm. So yes, it's something we don't want to be procuring some of those things like generators or other things during a storm. We want them, the Division of Aviation, have those resources to be able to move to GA airports. So yes, there is a list. We worked on it in our workshop, and that'll be part of that recommendation report.
Perfect. And when I say pre-position, do you think you'd have them out at the airports, or would you have them in a central location and try to get them distributed?
So I think in the perfect world, we would have it pre-positioned. Like we knew pretty well that it was going to be a Western North Carolina event. I think in the perfect situation, NCDOT, we're fortunate to have, you know, statewide office. We have an office in every county, so it's something where I would look to pre-position it at other DOT facilities. But at the end of the day, you also don't always know, right? Like there was the last time Western North Carolina got hit by a hurricane, it was a hurricane that hit the coast, and then an arm came up and hit the mountains, and the mountains were already saturated. It was not to the scale of Helene, of course, but we, looking at the track of that hurricane, would never have predicted that the mountains would be so devastated by that storm. So you can look at tracks and you can anticipate where things may happen, but you have to be flexible and ready. So probably looking at like a regional EOC or one of our larger division offices on the NCDOT side to pre-position those.
Cool. All right.
Same
Thank
thing
you.
with drone teams,
And then,
too. Pre-positioning drone teams.
Yeah, that's especially if you know if the event's coming. So that makes sense. And then one more, Nick, question for you. What software did you use to process that data? Because that's a huge amount of data. Were you using an off the shelf like the Pix4D, or does Esri have a product for that?
Yeah, we were using Esri for most of all of them, but we also were using Hexagon's OrthoPro suite. So we also use that as well. So we found Esri did not like the big counties, and that was one of our kind of struggles. That GIS, when we started putting in, you know, thousands of images to process, and then we let it process for the weekend and come back and it still be, you know, 5%. It just did not like that. So yeah, we relied a lot on Hexagon OrthoPro suite to do a lot of processing for the bigger counties. And then once we made the Mosaic, then we kind of pushed that up into, you know, the Esri world, the AGOL, the dashboard, you know, that Jamie made to kind of get that out to our clients.